Hello, everyone. My name is Hugo Dorado. I'm a researcher from the CED and Biodiversity Alliance, and we're going to talk about data mining today. And this material is part of the course for fundamentals of data mining in agriculture that's been coordinated between the Biodiversity CED Alliance, Illinois University, CIMMYT, and the CCAPS project. In this presentation, I would like to go over some concepts and terms about data mining, and also, I'd like to go over some procedures to analyze the information with this approach. In this presentation, we're going to go over some of the important definitions in data mining. We'll also assess some of the steps that are fundamental for being able to analyze these databases with this approach, among them pre-processing of data. Some structures still have to be accommodated before the training session of this model. We are going to go over some types of learning that can be used in data mining. And specifically, we'll talk about two different approaches, and we'll also assess some supervised models. So the presentation is going to focus a lot on this part of supervised models. And the presentation for clustering is going to be the next one after going over this topic. We'll also go over some error types that are important to take into account the quality of the models that we are generating. And we'll also revise some strategies for dataset partitioning. That's a necessary process in order to have a proper validation of the model that we are producing. So we have to do a strategic partitioning of that data. We'll also go over some performance measures depending on the problem that we want to solve. And we'll also talk about parameter optimization of those supervised models, which is also very important. And finally, we'll assess some ways on how we can do model interpretation. As part of the definitions that are important to take into account, and this is a question that they ask very often, what's the difference between big data and data mining? Big data is a trend to analyze large volumes of data, and it's become very fashionable because the information is being analyzed which is not structured, and it does not have the typical database format. They have infograms, satellite images, voice recordings, text. So there's a lot of available information, and that trend and on using that information that can be generated in large volumes is part of the big data concept. Collecting, processing, analyzing information, and take decisions based on that information. And data mining is an area of science that's more specific, and it involves disciplines like statistics and machine learning, computation, and it's also focused on trying to exploit the knowledge that can be generated from databases. So they're related because big data many times uses the tools from data mining. For example, the analytical part in order to analyze all of those big data sets. So these are the two concepts that we have to understand properly. And now, going into the topic, there are some concepts about this concept of data mining and machine learning. The first thing is what's the name of the variables? Generally speaking, we have a set of input variables, also called features. And this is a set of variables that we use to try and explain a variable that we are interested in, an output variable. In statistics, the regressions with this are called predictors or explainable variables. But here we call them inputs. The output variable, which is the variable that we are interested in the linear regression language, would be our response, our answer. And that's the variable that we're focusing mostly. The problem that we're analyzing, the output variable would be yield, sustainability, and the characteristics would be the climate variables for soil and management also. There's also another term that talks about the cost function, and this is the function that can help us create the model that we're talking about. This function allows us to maximize the relationships between this set of variables in such way that the transformation that can be applied here can be the closest to that output variable that we are trying to predict. And obviously we're going to generate an error because it's very hard for this set of variables, input variables could reproduce that output variable. Now, diving into the steps that are taken into account for doing data mining. Once you've collected information, which is also a very important process, and we've talked about this in previous information presentations. First, we have to select the variables, and some of the models, like the neural networks, require of a structure of the matrix for category variables. They cannot read those category variables uh, by default. So we have to apply transformations that are called variable dummification. And this means that we have to transform each one of those possible categories into binary variables. And then the model can read and analyze that data. It's not necessary to do this for every model. For example, random forest does not have this constraint, but some models for neural networks they have to take into account this pre-processing before training the model. On the other hand, sometimes it's necessary to do a normalization of data. This because in the case of input variables, many of them have different scales. For example, the temperature is registered in Celsius degrees, precipitation in millimeters, the percentage of texture in percentages, or the percentage of texture of silt, and the characteristics of soil are in percentages. So we have to carry out this normalization in order to help the model um, to find that function that allows it to link those input and output variables. Another important aspect, and that we're going to see in one of those further presentations, would be the attribute selection. This is based on starting with a data set that has many variables, but some of those variables, even after a first selection, they're probably not so informational because they have low variability or probably they're correlated between each other. So sometimes it's very useful if we help the algorithm and we remove those variables that are redundant or that are irrelevant for the model. And in the end, we have a data set, uh, or I'm sorry, with variables that's more reduced, and it's going to be easier for the model to train. And it's also going to be easier for us to read and interpret it. Regarding the types of apprenticeship that we can find in machine learning, we can classify them in two, machine learning and data mining specifically. They can be classified in both in two. The first one would be supervised and unsupervised analysis. In unsupervised, the main characteristic is that we have a variable that's of interest. For example, we have a characteristic in this population, and it's if it belongs to the group of blues or browns. So that's the variable that we're interested in. In the training exercise, we can classify what group every member of the population belongs to, and this will be the training. And normally the main purpose is to create a function to do a prediction. Or so if a new individual comes in who is going to be assessed based on that function that I want to build, I'd have to define if it belongs to the group of the brown or the blue group. So this would be the variable that I'm interested in, and that's why this is unsupervised learning model. The variable can be qualitative, and in this case, we'll be talking about a classification model. because what we want to do is to classify if a new individual comes, which group it's going to be allocated in. If that would be a numerical variable, then we would be talking about a regression model. And what we would do here would be a prediction of numeric values in order to have it as close as possible to the value of the variable in the database, the one that we're interested in. On the other side, the unsupervised models, we don't have um, that interest weight. They all have the same importance. Sometimes you want to have a relationship, want to seek for the relationship that could exist between the variables. In unsupervised models, we have to have a cluster analysis. So between a group of individuals, we have to identify which of them are more similar, and then we have to build this group so that they are as similar uh, between each other. So here we can assess different characteristics where the way they dress, the professions, and we try to group them in specific clusters. As you can see, there's no main variable here. The way they dress and the profession and other things that can be assessed there have the same importance. So in that case, we would be talking about unsupervised analysis. For both analysis, the important thing is that we can analyze what's the importance of the variables. Among the different variables that we can measure, those input variables, there are some that help more for this classification. So the methods allow us to do this ranking of variables to determine which are the most important. The same thing for the unsupervised. Some of them will probably contribute more for carrying out the differentiation of groups and characteristics. So it's also important to assess that importance.